Okay, let's get started with the second module. In this module, there's two ideas that we need to explore. One is the fact that, and the idea that anthropology is a science. What do we mean by that? What is a scientific endeavor, and how is this scientific endeavor different from other ways of understanding the world? One thing that I want to make clear to you is that I do respect and I do understand that there are many different ways of understanding reality out there. But the scientific method has a value, has a role to play that is critically important. And of course, from the discipline, we value quite a bit and we find quite justified and important and something that we need to keep uh, as a very valid knowledge. For many, actually, as the valid knowledge. But anyways, the thing is as we explore some of the elements of the deep profound evolutionary history of humankind, some of you might find yourselves a little bit like challenging your religious beliefs. And I want to be very clear, and I want to explain how I see this, the importance of this distinction, and my recommendation for you as to how to handle this. So that's the second idea that we're going to be exploring. That is the idea that religious beliefs are sometimes at odds with scientific knowledge. How do we handle that difference? Is something that we can handle. Uh, when we have scientific knowledge, should we exclude any religious understanding and vice versa? That's a personal decision, but what I'm giving to you right now is some of the elements so that we can start having this conversation. But I have to be crystal clear. If you're going to embrace scientific knowledge, then you have to abide by the rules of the scientific knowledge. It is not okay to say we're gonna follow a scientific approach up to this point, and then religion trumps or philosophical beliefs will trump your scientific understanding. That Science doesn't work like that. We cannot use some parameters that is empirical evidence and then discard that one because we have certain beliefs. And sometimes it's difficult to deal with these differences. I think this is gonna be clear as we get into the specifics of the evolutionary history of humankind. Let's first start with some generative questions that I want you to have present as we go over not just this presentation but the entire module. It needs to be studied and learned and understood by you. What is the scientific method? What do we mean by scientific method when we say scientific method? Secondly, if there are other valid ways of explaining the world around us, what are those different ways of understanding the world around us? And I can think of religion, I can think of philosophy, I can think of metaphysical approach, and there's all kinds of different approaches. We can even talk about poetry as a way to explain and cope with large questions. So, as we know that science is not the only way of explaining the world, then we should have a clear understanding of the distinctions between those other modes of seeing the world, ways of seeing, and the scientific method. And then, is it possible to keep those things interrelated somewhat harmoniously? And that's, to me, that ends up being sort of a personal answer you have to give. But my job is to make sure that you understand the parameters and you understand the contradictions that sometimes arise from those different understandings and ways of seeing things. Can we reconcile those distinctions? I don't know. That's a good question for us to explore during the semester. And then going back to the initial question, so if we know what is a scientific method, then we should ask in what ways anthropology is a scientific discipline. And you're going to find it interesting that, and not even the anthropologists actually agree fully in this understanding of anthropology as a pure scientific method. But one thing we all can agree on is the fact that there are many questions that we have to understand: who are we, where we come from, and what's the meaning of our existence, if any. The scientific method will be a special set of rules, a specific set of rules that we use to address some of these questions. Some basic definitions that we want to keep in mind as we explore this module. It will be science, hypothesis, induction, deduction, and theory. So science, as you all know, it's a method of inquiry, and it basically demands a generation, testing, and acceptance or rejection of hypotheses. So you ask a question, and then you have an educated guess as to how the question should be answered, and then you will test that hypothesis by gathering, generating, and testing through the use of empirical data. Empirical data means data that is coming to you from your senses, something that is tangible, that we can touch, that we can process, that we can measure. That's what we mean by empirical data. So the hypothesis, as I proposed a second ago, it's a tentative explanation for something that is going on out there. And it's an educated guess, educated in the sense that you have an inkling as to what's a potential answer. Some scientists have to be open to have those educated guesses being wrong and then start all over again. And those guesses are proven wrong by the empirical data that is being collected and then analyzed. In order to reach conclusions about certain things and about understanding the world, we have basically since the 16th, 17th century two ways of doing this. One is the inductive method, which is something that the Greeks already had pretty clear in their minds, which is by gathering lots of information about the specific elements, I can reach a sense of what is the general element. So by looking at 100 chairs, eventually can reach the idea of what a chair is. So that will be the inductive way of generating scientific statements. And then once we have generalized and universalistic understandings of things, we can apply those ideas to explain other phenomena. And that'll be sort of the deductive method. The deductive method is one that actually is presented in the form of an if-then statement. If this happens, then the other happens. You're bringing together two variables and showing the interrelationship of it. Once you have proven one variable, if the other, if this condition exists, then the other should be also the case. You look for the data, and then the data should probably demonstrate that that correlation is correct. That's the deductive method. We'll explore more cases as we go along. And then last but not least, very important, is theory, as a general idea that explains a large set of factual patterns. That is, a theory would try to encompass a larger reality. The theory of relativity is a theory that explains the relationships between bodies in the celestial heavens. And it's not the theory of how life was generated. So theories actually try to explain a set of questions and patterns that somehow we find interrelated. So there's more than one theory, but the scientific world is ruled by the same rules no matter what. So what are those rules? Well, first thing is that a scientific idea must be empirically testable. So we need to be able to gather information that is valid and reliable, that is something that we can measure and test and see and observe. And if we can gather that information, then we can be able to test any scientific idea. Second thing that is interesting is that any hypothesis must be falsifiable, and it must be coming in the form of an answerable question. This is something that philosophers like Karl Popper have explained quite well. Karl Popper is the name. So falsifiable. Let's say, for example, that we indicate as a statement of hypothesis that there is life in another planet. All right, so to be able to prove that there is life in another planet, we shall be able to talk to people that are, or organisms that are living in that other planet, or seeing organisms living in another planet. We should be getting some form of phone call from the other planet, or we should be able to send a spaceship and go and find that life and take pictures of the life in the other planet. Thing is since we cannot gather that information, we cannot for that assume that the hypothesis is wrong. So I don't have a way to prove it right, and I don't have a way to prove it wrong. And in that sense, the question remains in the realm of the non-scientific understanding of things, or plausibility of things. So in that sense, that question, that hypothesis that is life in another planet, happens to be a non-scientific one. And Area 52 will attest that all of that is the realm of a speculation, and it does for nice, interesting stories and whatnot, but it is not in the realm of science. Scientific knowledge can be repeated, that we can test again and test again. It must be universal, it must apply without exceptions, and there must be explanations for those exceptions. So when something is not behaving as it is expected because of the universal laws that are being defined by scientists, then we should be able to find a way to explain that as an exception, and that will keep that hypothesis and the proof of the hypothesis as stable. Now, in the realm of the social sciences and in the realm of anthropology, things get a little bit more difficult. Not easier, but more difficult. We are producing knowledge about other cultures from a cultural context and in a cultural context, from and in, which means that I need to take into account my bias. Need to take into account the context in which I ask those questions. If I'm an American anthropologist, I'm going to study another country in South America or in Africa, I go there asking questions that are relevant in my context, asking questions that other colleagues of mine that are around me would like me to ask there. So I'm coming, yes, with a scientific methodology, but nonetheless from a specific cultural context. Here's an example of Margaret Mead, which one of the most prominent anthropologists of the 20th century, and an author that I would strongly recommend you read, like Coming of Age in Samoa. She went to Samoa really interested in exploring the impact that culture has in the experience of adolescence in Western places. So the idea was to test if there was another cultural context in which adolescence was not as conflictive and difficult and interesting and dramatic phase of our lives as it was being in Victorian US and Victorian England and Victorian Europe, for that matter. So he went there with a question that was very much so relevant in her context. And then the story goes that you should be reading the book to know what the story like and how she's finding the differences between a Samoan culture and then Western and North American cultures. So again, I don't have to be concerned with the opinion that a microorganism has of me when I'm doing research on the microorganism or a physical object. What do I care what's the opinion that object has on me, or the opinion that I have of that object? It doesn't really affect. But when you're studying human life and culture, then it is important to think about those things, because you're going to have an effect, and those individuals that you are working with and studying will have an effect on you, because that's human nature. In that sense, the only way we can deal with bias in social sciences, and particularly in anthropology, is to write about it and make it visible, so that we can see to what extent my positionality is affecting my understanding of the thing that I'm studying. That doesn't mean that I cannot be, or I should not be, aspiring to be objective. I want to be objective, but I just have to be mindful that it is more so complicated than in other sciences, and I just need to be rigorous in my approach so that anyone else can come and test and validate or not the work that I'm doing to explain different cultures. All right, I'm going to leave it like that, and we're going to move on to exploring other elements of the chapter. It's an interesting chapter, hopefully one that will give you lots of food for thought, and will be a recap on things you already know, or will allow you to learn new things about the human experience. See you in the next one.